To get started, I'm going to create a rub. Now, most of you that are familiar with Texas-style brisket, when you smoke it, you could virtually use salt, pepper, and garlic powder and have a great Texas-style brisket. Heck, you could just use salt and pepper and have a great Texas-style brisket. But today, I'm going to create a rub and hopefully get that smoky flavor in the oven. I'll be using 2.5 tablespoons of salt, 1.5 tablespoons of ground pepper, 2 tablespoons of garlic powder, 2 tablespoons of onion powder. I'm also going to use 2 tablespoons of lemon pepper. And to get my smoky flavor, I am going to be using 4 tablespoons of smoked paprika. Now, smoked paprika is not the only way to impart smoky flavor when doing brisket in the oven. You could also use something like bacon or marinate it in liquid smoke. But today, I opted for smoked paprika. I'm also going to be using 1.5 teaspoons of ground cumin and 3 packed tablespoons of brown sugar. Now I'm just going to combine all of the spices in a bowl and mix well. I'd also like to mention that if you check the description below this video, you will find all of the ingredients and measurements that I used in this recipe. This week I will be releasing 4 videos, and they basically will be recipes for my Christmas dinner. After November, I'm pretty much turkeyed out. So when December hits, I always try to come up with a beef recipe for Christmas dinners. And this year, I am going to be serving a Texas-style inspired oven brisket. And when I mean Texas-inspired or Texas-style, I mean basically the flavor, not necessarily the texture, because low and slow on a smoker is the way to go. Okay, so here is the smoked paprika that I'm using for those of you that like to see the brands of things that I'm using. So now I'm just going to continue adding the ingredients and give it a good mix. Okay, so this ratio of spices gives you around a cup of rub, and I'm not going to use the full cup on this brisket. Now, if you do decide to use all of it, just know that it has 2.5 tablespoons of salt. So if you want to use all of it, scale back on the salt, or it might be too salty. But here's the bowl I'm going to use for the brisket, and I've reserved some because I'm not going to use all of it. And I actually love to use brisket rub in other recipes, which I'll show you later. Here I will be using a 7.5 pound whole brisket. And what I mean is that this is the flat and the point. The flat is the leaner part of the brisket. It's the leaner muscle, and the point is where the fat cap sits on top of it, which makes that the more juicier, moist and fattier part of the brisket, which is my favorite. So you can trim all the fat off this brisket if you want, but I will say this: the best method to cook brisket is low and slow, whether it's in the oven or on a barbecue pit, and you don't want to get rid of all of the fat. So I'm leaving whatever's on the brisket, I'm going to leave that there. I'm not taking it off. And this was market trimmed, meaning they already trimmed it and, had it ready for me. So if you can find a butcher or a market that sells it this way, good. And if you can't, good luck trimming it. I wish I could tell you how to do that. I'll leave some brisket links in the description below to help you out. Okay, so I'm going to continue seasoning and adding rub to this brisket. I'm adding rub and patting it on every square inch of this brisket. By the way, I'm using one clean hand to sprinkle the rub and the other one to pat it on there. And this will just help me reserve whatever's left over so I don't have to toss it out. Once I'm done seasoning the brisket, I am going to place it into a large Ziploc bag. This is a 2.5 gallon Ziploc bag. You can actually put this in a large pan and cover it in foil. Here is my leftover rub. I will be reserving that in the container I had earlier. So what I'm going to do is place my brisket in the refrigerator and allow it to marinate overnight. You want to give this time. This is a lengthy process. If you don't have time to make this brisket, it's probably not going to come out good. So I'm going to do this overnight and let it marinate. That's my suggestion. Okay, so it has been overnight. Here is my reserved rub. I will be using this in a minute here. I'm also going to be using 2 pounds of onion. This was basically somewhere between 6 to 8 small to medium onions that I've thinly sliced. And I'm also going to be using 2 cups of beef broth. Now, the method that I'm using to start cooking this brisket, I got from Andrew Zimmern's beef brisket recipe, and I will put the link to his video below. Basically, I'm going to be using the roasting pan. I put it on the stovetop, and I want to show you, I'm using a low setting because things will burn if the roasting pan gets too hot. And you want to make sure you're using a roasting pan that can go on the top burners. Not all roasting pans can go on the top. This is stainless steel. So I've added around a 1/4 cup of oil, and now I'm just going to sear the brisket for around 5 minutes on each side. And this will get things started for a good braise. Okay, so once I'm done searing both sides of the brisket, I'm going to set it to the side and just let it hang out. And now I'm going to saute these onions. And as you can see, there was some charring in the pan there, and that's because there is sugar in the rub. So of course, some things are going to get burned, but that's why you want to work with the low heat. So I'm going to season these onions with a teaspoon of that reserved brisket rub, and here it is. I'm just going to add a heaping teaspoon to these onions and continue sauteing until they are translucent. My onions are where I want them, so now I'm going to add the 2 cups of beef broth, give everything a mix, and sort of deglaze the pan a little bit. Okay, so my onions are done. Now I'm going to place the brisket on top of the onions with the fat cap side up. As you can see, I did get some good color on the fat cap from pan searing, and that's basically where the deeper color will come from. So at this point, you want to cover tightly with foil. I'm going to use like 3 sheets of foil. You really want to trap in the moisture. And I'm going to cook this in a preheated oven at 250 degrees Fahrenheit for 1 hour per pound. So basically, I'm going somewhere between 7 to 7.5 hours of cook time. You also want to make sure the internal temperature reaches 175 degrees Fahrenheit at least. Okay, so my brisket has been cooking for 7 hours and it is done. And here it is. It is absolutely beautiful. It rendered a lot of fat. There is some obviously juices in there, but there is a lot of fat. But I am not complaining because that is flavor. So I am going to place my brisket on a cutting board and I'm going to tightly wrap aluminum foil over it just to let it rest. You want to let your brisket rest at least 1 hour. I'm actually going to let it sit here for around 1.5 hours to 2 hours. You want to make sure it retains as much moisture as possible. Again, I stress to you, if you do not have time to cook a brisket and you are in a hurry, this might not be the recipe for you because it does take a lot of time. But I tell you what, the payoff is big when you allow your meat to rest well. So having said that, I am going to make a barbecue sauce. Here I fished out the onions from my roasting pan and placed them into a sauce pot. I even kind of chopped them up and broke them apart. They are so soft and juicy and tender, and I can't wait to eat them. Here I'm adding 1 tablespoon of brisket rub seasoning. I actually added 1.5 tablespoons. Basically, I will put the correct ingredients and measurements because I sort of played around with this barbecue sauce to get the flavor that I wanted. Okay, so I'm just going to continue combining that and letting the seasonings warm through. I'm not working with the high heat, by the way. Now I'm going to add 8 ounces of tomato puree. And you can definitely use ketchup, but I will be using brown sugar to sweeten this. So if you use ketchup, you might not want to use tons of brown sugar because then it'll be overly sweet. So into my pot, 8 ounces of tomato puree. And again, I just want to mention, again, I know I sound repetitive or like a broken record. In the video, I added ingredients, but off camera, I sort of adjusted it. So be sure to check the description below to get exactly what I used. Okay, next I'm going to add 1.5 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar. Now I'm going to add 1 tablespoon of Worcestershire sauce. I'm also going to add a packed 1/4 cup of brown sugar. And if you find this too much or just not enough, again, adjust to your taste. Now I just want to add a little side note. I typically do not like to use barbecue sauce with my brisket. I'm more of a just Texas style brisket. It's seasoned well and that's it. But I do like to make a sauce for those who like to keep things saucy. So now I'm going to add a tablespoon of spicy brown mustard. I will mix that in and allow this sauce to simmer for around 5 to 10 minutes and it's done. Okay, my brisket has rested for 2 hours and as you can see, it is not cold. There's still steam coming off of this. It retained the heat well, but hopefully it retained the moisture even better. So I just want to show you this. Basically, the point and flat will basically want to separate from itself because the fat has rendered. Everything's loosey-goosey in there, which is fantastic. So now I'm just going to cut the meat against the grain. And if you don't cut against the meat grain, you'll basically end up with stringy pieces. But here's a close-up look at my sliced brisket. And I gotta tell you, it's tender and it's moist. And I also want to show you the other things that I will be serving this with. I'm also going to be putting out a green bean recipe, a homemade ranch style beans recipe. And here's the barbecue sauce. This is what it looks like finished. I also made a sweet cornbread and I will be putting out a green chili mac and cheese recipe. This basically is going to be my holiday meal this year and we are excited to dive in. I hope you give this recipe a try. I hope you like it and thanks for watching.